Hello and welcome to the Grand Line Review, your source for everything One Piece. Today, we have a topic I've wanted to discuss for quite some time, and now that it's finally happened in the anime, I guess a couple of weeks ago now, let's talk about how Luffy emerged victorious in the impossible fight against Katakuri. So I've been tossing up about whether or not to actually make a video about this, because it doesn't really fit any of my formats, but after some comments on my anime reviews as well as the Katakuri 101 video, I feel like it is actually a very necessary discussion. And in order to have it, I'm mostly going to be using the manga as reference, just because the anime plays out a lot of the subtleties very differently, and to get to the core of Oda's intentions, I don't think there's any better way than to examine the first-hand material. And before we completely launch into it, I want to make this clear from the beginning. All of the following is my personal interpretation of the events. There is no straightforward answer to exactly what happened in the series. Like, Brule doesn't just pop in and go, Katakuri did X because of Y. It's very much left to the readers and the audience to connect the dots, which means that there isn't necessarily one correct interpretation. So if you guys saw things differently to me, then please do drop those thoughts in the comments, because it is a fascinating discussion. But for now, let's get into it. Alright, so a lot of the comments I received recently quite straightforwardly asked me how Luffy won or why Katakuri let him win, as well as posed explanations of their own, with a predominant thought being that Luffy won because of plot armor. And just before I completely dispel that argument, if you're not familiar with that term, it is the theory that the main character will always be protected by the fact that they simply cannot be removed from the story. So in this case, Luffy has to defeat Katakuri in order to move on with his journey. Now, almost every story is subject to this concept, but it only becomes a detrimental factor when the author cannot posit a satisfying and natural explanation as to why the main character overcame the problem they did. And this is where I think people are getting confused with Luffy versus Katakuri. They're having trouble understanding how this outcome eventuated, because on paper there is absolutely no way that Luffy conquers Katakuri. He's faster, stronger, significantly more experienced, and holds two highly elevated forms of haki, one of which Luffy begins to experience, but that simply isn't enough. In addition to that, he also has Conqueror's haki, so Luffy can't even use that to any sort of advantage. As well as the fact that Katakuri's Devil Fruit allowed him to mimic all of Luffy's attacks, except that Katakuri performed them even better. The one and only physical advantage we can give to Luffy in this fight is sheer endurance. He can tank hits like a champ and never let pain get the better of him. Luffy just will not allow himself to fall until his goal has been accomplished, and that mentality certainly plays into the results, especially considering that Luffy's goal actually changes mid-battle. And if you're one of the few people out there who still believe that Luffy physically overcame Katakuri, also bear in mind that Luffy was in a very bad condition before this fight even began. Whole Cake Island was not an easy arc for him at all, essentially beginning with an 11-hour bout against Charlotte Cracker, and after that he never really recovered. He was a wreck that no amount of magic milk could fix, and arrived at the wedding completely sleep deprived. So even if Luffy was as strong as Katakuri, which I personally do not believe in the slightest, he showed up to this conflict entirely unprepared and at a sharp disadvantage before the first punch was even thrown. If this fight was about strength alone, Katakuri would have won, which isn't to say that Luffy is weak by any means, because he was able to perform on Katakuri's level, he was just outclassed. And this is where the plot armor argument comes in. Those who pose this thought are thinking of this event purely as a fight, and that is a dangerous idea because it locks your mind into thinking that the only way out of this situation is for Luffy to be stronger than Katakuri, and that did not happen. So when Luffy ends up victorious after not having achieved the needed strength, it doesn't sit right with certain fans, and to them it feels like Oda made Katakuri too strong and had to more or less make him give up to have Luffy continue his journey. And if that were the case, then yes, that would be an example of plot armor. And that way of thinking takes so much away from what this fight was actually doing. But two things are undeniably true. The first is that Katakuri was simply too strong for Luffy to overcome. However, it was not a mistake to make him that strong. And secondly, it's also true that Katakuri resigned from the fight. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, why? Because I don't say that Katakuri gave up to take anything away from Luffy's victory. I say it because what happened is far more impressive than simply physically defeating your opponent. And it goes to the core of what makes Luffy so dangerous. The ability mentioned by Mihawk all the way back in Marineford, which I'll quote now. It's not his powers or techniques. He possesses some quality that makes people want to help him. And in these waters, that is the most formidable power of all. Now, to be clear, Luffy did not win because Katakuri all of a sudden went, oh yeah, look, I just kind of want to help the kid out. It's not that simple. People don't just join Luffy like that, not antagonists anyway. They succumb to Luffy because their encounters with him change those characters at their core. One of the better examples of this in the past is Bellamy. After encountering Luffy, Bellamy's beliefs were challenged, and as much as he may not have forgone his dedication to Doflamingo, his mind was unlocked, and he pursued an adventure to Skypiea, a location that he had previously thought was utter nonsense of a legend. A massive part of Bellamy's his character evolved, and he even developed a respect for Luffy as a result. And that is the sort of journey Katakuri went on during this brief 17 chapter and 21 episode long fight with Luffy. And to understand this transformation, we really do need to flag how Katakuri became the person he is today. Now, a lot of this I went over in my 101 on him, so I'll be brief, but due to a mixture of the teasing he received because of his mouth and the attacks on his family, at a very early age, Katakuri resolved to become an individual capable of commanding enough fear to protect his siblings. He offered himself as a symbol of constant strength that his family could depend on. Now, here's that question again. Why? Why was that ever needed if they were the children of someone powerful enough to become a Yonko? Well, that's because Big Mom is essentially a child. She is the matriarch of the family in name alone, and not only is she completely unreliable in their protection, but she is actually the biggest threat to all of their lives, as a single mood swing can result in her killing any or all of them. That is the sort of fear that every member of the Charlotte family lives with on a daily basis. And if you were to ask any one of them if they'd prefer a world without Big Mom in it, I'd bet that most of them would honestly answer yes. And that's where Katakuri's model of fear comes from. He adopted that aspect of Big Mom, but only in relation to his enemies. When it came to his family, he was a perfect and reliable pillar of stability. And that word perfect is very important because a legend developed around Katakuri of him being a perfect individual. So much so that allegedly his back had never even touched the ground. Of course, we know that this is completely false, and Katakuri is just some guy who propagated this belief for the sake of others. But even then, it can certainly be argued that he began to believe his own lie. This perfection became his ideology, and that is what Luffy directly challenged in this fight. Not his strength, but his beliefs. And it was on this battlefield that Luffy proved victorious. It was a long journey to get there though, and it does start with another argument from those who claim that Luffy invoked plot armor. That argument being, why didn't Katakuri finish Luffy quickly when he clearly had the upper hand? There were surely countless opportunities to kill the Straw Hat Captain with ease that just weren't taken. But the counter argument to this being that very early on, Katakuri quite clearly states that Luffy being able to dodge so many of his attacks is stressful, meaning that he was simply incapable of finishing him off. But this statement is very important for another reason, which is Katakuri admitting that Luffy's constant ability to evade him is stressful, meaning that as much as Katakuri wasn't physically taxed during this portion of the fight, he was being drained mentally. And if that sounds lame, just picture it as if you're playing chess or another strategy-based game. If you play long enough, you will experience mental fatigue, especially if you're not used to playing against opponents you can't instantly beat, which is exactly what Katakuri is doing here. He's not seasoned enough in regards to actually fighting people anywhere near close to his level. So as much as it looks like it's just Luffy suffering alone, that is not the case, because even in these opening stages, this fight is taking a toll on Katakuri. Not enough for any major change to occur yet, but it's a starting point. It's something that began to put the notion of Katakuri's invincibility to the test. And it has a knock-on effect because it leads into the late Merienda, and the subsequent reveal of Katakuri's true personality to Luffy. Now, I would equate the moment of Luffy intruding on Katakuri's snack time to the legendary punch in the face Bellamy received on Jaya. It was an instant shattering of everything that character had been built up to be. And in the case of Katakuri, this revelation of his true self did far more damage to him than anything Luffy had physically thrown at him previously, or even in the events to come. And the interesting thing is that Luffy just didn't care at all. He caught a glimpse of this embarrassing glutton of a man with a weird mouth, and all he had to say in response was, "Our fight isn't over." Luffy then proceeded to take advantage of Katakuri's less than perfect mental state to prove that he isn't physically invincible either by landing several hits, a feat that Katakuri both praises Luffy for as well as chastises himself for allowing. And he never truly recovers from this. As much as he later tried to affirm to himself that he is invincible so long as he remains calm, the damage was done. Despite his physical superiority, Katakuri was losing the mental battle, now confronted directly with the truth that he is not the perfect individual he had been pretending to be, as well as the fact that he simply cannot wrap his mind around why Luffy keeps getting back up. Why does this shameful creature keep getting up and confronting me when there is no logical chance of victory, and furthermore, why am I incapable of keeping him down? And now at this stage, Katakuri's perfect persona now hinges entirely on him defeating Luffy, and he is finding that task every bit as impossible as Luffy is finding defeating him, albeit for different reasons. Luffy can't make Katakuri go down at all, and Katakuri can't stop Luffy from getting back up. And that is when the Flampe thing happens. Absolutely perfect timing for Luffy. If Flampe had used her blowgun any earlier during the fight, particularly before the Merienda incident, I think Katakuri would have taken the win and eliminated a threat to his family. However, after having his perfection directly challenged, any victory that wasn't solely a result of his actions would essentially become an admission that he was not capable of beating Luffy on his own, and thus be deemed an imperfect being. Flampe's interference was the point of no return. Following this, Katakuri had no choice but to acknowledge his own failures. The fact that he had been unable to defeat Luffy prior to this point, as well as being unable to prevent Flampe from contaminating the fight. In fact, he even goes so far as to apologize to Luffy for not noticing her in time. And of course, this culminates in Katakuri's acceptance of his true nature, by revealing his face to Flampe and even allowing her minions to photograph him, which is a far cry from when he slaughtered the chef simply for catching a glimpse of his face earlier that day. Then we have the ever iconic line of Katakuri stating that he will no longer assume that Luffy is inferior to him. And while this does without a doubt show a great deal of respect for Luffy, my main takeaway from this is not that Katakuri has elevated Luffy to his level in his mind. Rather, Katakuri has brought himself back down to earth and realized that in the grand scheme of things, he's no better than Luffy, despite his physical superiority. And this is enormously liberating, because for the first time in his adult life, Katakuri no longer has to play the part of perfection. He can just let loose and be himself. And as his first act of true autonomy, he decided to honor Luffy's wishes to finish the fight. From this moment on, Luffy was no longer Katakuri's enemy. But it's here we counter another storytelling argument though, as the two go on to trade blows over an extended period before Luffy finally unveils Snake Man. And the question here is, why did it take Luffy so long to whip this out? A question that often implies that this is an ass pull from Oda, and there is no good explanation as to why Luffy did not use Snake Man earlier. There is definitely a good explanation though, and like a lot of what's happening here, it's very open to interpretation, but to me it all comes back to Luffy's mid-fight conversation with Brûlé. Earlier in the video, I said that Luffy's goal changed halfway during this fight, and this is the point where it happened, where he was pondering over whether or not he would be able to develop Future Sight, as well as Rayleigh's words about Haki blooming in battle. And after that particular point, Luffy did not invoke Gear 4th again until right at the end with Snake Man. This is because his goal was no longer simply to defeat Katakuri and move on, but to enhance his own observation Haki through extreme use as directed by Rayleigh. And using any form of Gear 4th would be highly counterproductive to this effort because of the fact that after extended use, Luffy loses the ability to use Haki altogether for 10 minutes. So to breed the most extreme conditions for Luffy's Haki to develop, it makes all the sense in the world to stay in his base form, where he can continue to pursue observation whilst also allowing him access to unrestricted armament Haki in order to defend himself against Katakuri, because without it, Luffy has zero chance whatsoever. And so at the point where Snake Man comes into it, that is Luffy saying that he has either gotten everything he needs from this fight, or, and I think this is much more likely, that he has reached even his physical limit and needs to finish this now. I say the latter is more likely because in the manga the artwork is just brutal, and it's very visually clear in one panel in particular that Luffy can barely get back up to his feet. So Snake Man happens, which allows Luffy to fight on a sort of equal footing with Katakuri, although he is still clearly stronger and faster, which you can see because Luffy's punches don't have anywhere near the effect on him that Katakuri's punches are still having on Luffy, and by the fact that Katakuri is still capable of dodging most of these insane Snake Man hits, but with that said, he isn't capable of quickly adapting enough to the form, and then we have the final physical clash of the fight, which does knock out both combatants. Now there is definitely a discussion to be had here because it can be argued that because of the flow of the panels, that Katakuri only allows himself to fall after Luffy has already done the same. It can also be said that Luffy got in a good hit because the final strike was an attack on Katakuri's stomach, which would have also hit his self-inflicted trident injury. I'm not going to strongly argue either of those points because that goes a bit too deeply into the realm of interpretation even for me, but the fact is that Katakuri fell second and he was the first to get back on his feet. He was exhausted and he was greatly injured, but he was ready to keep going. The only issue being that he had no real reason left to fight. Luffy wasn't his enemy, he had no reputation to protect, and his family were in no real danger. Well, I mean, except from Big Mom herself. And so the question becomes, will you be back someday to topple Big Mom? And this is the stark contrast of what Katakuri has become over the course of the fight. He went from believing without a doubt that Luffy is inferior to him in every way, to believing that one day he could defeat someone whom Katakuri himself could never hope to stand against. And that is Luffy's victory. Because while this fight was won by Katakuri in the physical arena, it was won by Luffy in the psychological arena. This fight changed Katakuri as a person, shattering his obligation to be the perfect being that he thought he needed to become from childhood. He got a taste of the freedom that is one of the core motivations for piracy all across the planet, and furthermore, Luffy himself represented a sliver of hope in an otherwise impossible world. So after hearing Luffy's declaration to become the Pirate King, a phrase that he is bound to have heard his mother say at multiple points, and a feat that even she has never managed to achieve, there's nothing left to do but accept that, as so many characters eventually come to do with Luffy, and finally, Katakuri completely embraces who he is and falls onto his back, very purposely destroying the #1 rumor in regards to his invincible persona. And that's kind of that. Katakuri had no reason to keep fighting. One of his main driving forces to continue the fight was Luffy's desire to continue it. So once Luffy stated that this would be the final clash, it was done. The two of them parted ways with great respect for one another, and that's the end of that. Alright, that took a lot longer than I thought it would, but once again, I feel like this was a necessary discussion to put out there. In my opinion, this was a fantastic event in One Piece where the outcome of a fight didn't just hinge on Luffy physically overcoming someone, and it's definitely one of my favorite clashes in the entire series. A lot of people are still going to complain and shit all over it because they feel it's badly written, primarily probably because they haven't taken the time to understand that a character is much more than their physical prowess, but whatever. There may even be some accusations that I'm a blind fanboy and I'm just seeing what I want to see, which is ironic because those are the people who were probably only paying half attention to the fight. But once again, whatever. I'm no Oda apologist. One Piece has its problems, yes, even in the manga. Just like Katakuri, it's not perfect. But this fight is not one of those moments. It was a well-crafted, unique event in the series. And that pretty much does it for my interpretation of Luffy vs Katakuri. If you enjoyed this video and the content this channel produces in general, then please consider donating to the Grand Line Review Patreon, because the support of all of you amazing people is what continues to make this channel possible. Also, do check out my Teespring store if you're interested in shirts, hoodies, and other miscellaneous items, with the proceeds going directly to support the channel as well. And if you'd like to join the fun, then please do head over to my Discord server where a wide array of shenaniganry takes place on a daily basis. And finally, please do comment with your thoughts on Luffy vs Katakuri. This has been the Grand Line Review, and I'll see you next time.